fared worse than India, they are Argentina and Mexico. Economic survey estimates output contraction to be 7.7% during the financial year 2021 compared to the previous year 2019-20. Official sources are very optimistic about a V-shaped recovery taking place with a projected GDP growth rate of over 10% in the next fiscal year, that is 21-22. This translates into about 2 percentage point rise in GDP size compared to that in the pre-COVID year, that is 19-20. So if 2021 was a washout year, then the increment between 19-20 and 21-22 is just 2%, which is less than which is probably just equal to about the increase in population growth rate. So in per capita terms, it would mean that there's hardly been any growth in over 2-year period. Impact on the labor market. In a country like India, where 90% of the workers are employed in the informal sector, defined as, working either as self-employed workers or wage workers. When you say informal workers, mean without practically any form of social security, the abrupt lockdown has been a disaster. They lost their jobs and livelihoods. Migrant workers among them walked literally hundreds of miles to the safety of their villages. Heartrending images of such workers in mass media are ached in popular memory. Many workers lost their lives. There is no proper count of them. Responding to a question in the parliament recently, the Union Minister for Labour and Employment admitted, in fact, for the first time, government admitted during the nationwide lockdown amidst COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, more than 1.14 crore, that is 10.14 million interstate migrant workers returned to their home states. This was perhaps the first instance of official admittance of the magnitude of the migrant crisis caused by the abrupt lockdown. This is perhaps the largest internal migration India has witnessed after the great tragedy of the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. Azam Premji University COVID-19 Livelihood Survey compilation of findings is a valuable source of factual information on the impact of the pandemic on lockdown on India's informal sector. I'm mentioning this in particular because there is no official source of the information. Azam Premji University has done a reasonable job of putting together various pieces of information on one place. So anybody interested in know the details can look at this source. Unfortunately, government has been reluctant to admit the gravity of the problem caused by the sudden lockdown. However, it has claimed credit for preventing large-scale deaths due to the virus. Of course, this is a counterfactual which can never be proven in much of economics. India's prior growth slowdown. The pandemic and economic crisis rubbed salt on the long-standing slowdown during 2010s. During this period, GDP annual growth rate declined from 78% in 2011-12 to 4% in 1920. Unprecedented collapse of fixed investment and saving rates as percentage of GDP by 7 to 8 percentage points of GDP. Job loss growth in 2010s. Previously, we used to talk about jobless growth, but 2010 had the distinction of witnessing job loss growth. For the first time since India started measuring employment and unemployment nationwide, that is since 1973-74, India lost jobs. And in manufacturing sector alone, 3.5 million workers lost jobs between 2011-12 and 17-18. Decline in output growth and collapse of employment resulted in a rise in poverty rates, expectedly, denting child nutritional status between 2015-16 and 2019-20, as per partial results of National Family Health Survey results released. Sorry, there's a typo here, please don't mind. Okay, here are the basic graphs. Kindly take a look at this. This is the GDP growth rate. This is real growth rate, net of inflation, how it looks like an inverted U-shaped curve between 2012-13 and 19-20. In fact, this figure is slightly outdated. The actual figures for 2019-20, as per the latest national accounts, is in fact 4%, not 5%. This is the saving and investment gross capital formation to GDP ratio and gross domestic savings or gross national savings to the GDP ratio. One can see that 2007-8 was a peak period. That is just before the global financial crisis, when India boomed at 8 to 9%. From then onwards, one can clearly see a steady decline in both the savings and investment ratios. This is completely unprecedented. Nowhere, never in India's history, in the post-independent history, did we ever come across this kind of a decline. So it is no wonder, it is no surprise to any reasonable economist that GDP growth rate has slowed down. Then if GDP growth rate has slowed down, per capita income has slowed down, employment has declined, so it is natural to expect an increase in poverty, because after all, poverty is measured in terms of consumption. Okay, so one can see that between 2011-12 and 17-18, the poverty has increased both in urban and rural areas. Response to the crisis, response to the pandemic and crisis. Globally, the health crisis is seen as a sudden contraction in aggregate demand, especially consumer demand, and the employer's inability to pay wages. Most governments, regardless of their political leanings, have expanded public spending to support incomes and livelihoods. This has increased public debt to GDP ratios and breaching the fiscal deficit targets, which is widely accepted as the correct response to the crisis. In fact, sorry. Yeah, sorry, bear with me for my clumsiness in handling the. Okay, as IMF report said, the steep contraction in output and ensuring fall in revenues, along with sizable discretionary support, have led to a surge in government debt and deficits. Global public debt is expected to reach an all-time high, exceeding 101% of GDP in 2020-21, a surge of 19 percentage points from a year ago. Meanwhile, average overall fiscal deficit is expected to soar to 14% of GDP in 2020, 10 percentage points higher than last year. So this is what IMF is expecting about the average of all its members. So India is also expecting a similar increase. So there's nothing different about it. India's response has been quite at variance from the global pattern. In May last year, amid the deep economic contraction, the government announced a 20 million rupee Atmanirbhar economic package to address the crisis. A close reading of the package showed that most of it addressed credit supply, increased credit guarantees, but very little rise in public expenditure. The increased public spending is in the range of 0.9% to 1.5% of GDP, according to various estimates. This was one of the lowest among major countries of the world, as reported by Moody's Analytics, figure below. Okay, I'll just show you the figure. Yeah, this is the figure. You can see India's response to crisis, fiscal support as a percentage of 2019 GDP. This is the calendar year. You can see that India, among all major countries, is the lowest, and US is the highest. Okay. Despite much vocal support, the government's current and capital expenditures have hardly moved up in the first half of 2021, that is April, September 20, when compared to the previous year, as reported in the quarterly national accounts. Okay. So this is the bottom line of what I have said so far is the government has been extremely conservative in providing fiscal support. Whatever government has done is basically providing credit support and credit guarantees for those who borrow. But this does not help a situation where there is a problem of demand, not of supply. Many industries, many firms, especially MSMEs, are reluctant to borrow because they do not see much demand in the market. So it's making available credit does not solve the problem of demand. It only solves the problem of potential supply. Okay. Structural reforms instead. Border skirmishes with China made India realize its import dependence on that country. Atmanirbhar Bharat self-reliance agenda was initiated in response. The health pandemic also revealed India's limited manufacturing capabilities in critical items such as imports for bulk drugs and fertilizers and so on. The PM's call for Atmanirbhar Bharat during the lockdown, reiterated in the Independence Day address, seemed a tacit admission of growing external economic threat to the nation. The policy sought to incentivize domestic production by PLI, production-linked incentives, to achieve self-reliance in manufacturing. The government perceived an opportunity during lockdown to bring about changes in major laws without parliamentary scrutiny and oversight. The ongoing agitation against the new farm laws is an example of it. We are familiar with what's going on. Similarly, government passed changes in labor laws. Just to give some details, India has a large number of labor laws, many of them having overlapping jurisdiction. So during the last 20 years, there have been efforts to rationalize them into major codes, labor codes. So this government, during the lockdown, has abridged about some 30 or 40 laws, central government laws, into 4 labor codes and passed them without discussion in the parliament. Okay. Currently, the government is framing rules to implement the new labor codes, which are expected to come into force in April this year. Okay. On the face of it, new labor codes offer greater flexibility to employers to deploy workers to meet the changing needs and extend social security benefits to informal workers. The reality seems far grave. Just on the positive side, there's been talk that for workers, the drivers of Ola and Uber taxis will get social security benefit, but we do not know how it will be implemented. That's on the positive side. Okay. In the name of flexibility, however, workers' right to overtime pay and weekly paid leave seems to be compromised. I'm using very tentative terms because the details are still not very clear to us. What is clear to us is when it was implemented at the factory level in Karnataka, it led to huge violence. The recent violence at Wistron iPhone assembly factory in Karnataka is an early example of the conflict that are likely to emerge when the new labor code will be implemented soon. The gist of it is that the workers were made to work for 12 hours, but were paid only for 8 hours. And they were made to work 7 days a week, whereas they were paid for 5 days a week. And these are the few sketchy details we have detailed. The full picture is still not known. But this angered workers and they went on a rampage, and the factory has been closed down for the last 2 months. There are efforts to open the factory, but unless these conflicts are resolved, the factory is unlikely to open. Why I'm mentioning about it is this is probably the next front on which there is likely to be a conflict between the government's structural reforms introduced during the pandemic and various sections of Indian society. Okay. Critique of structural reform. This is important. What are structural reforms? I quote the official definition from OECD. They work on the supply side of the economy by tackling obstacles to the efficient production of goods and services. They should help increase productivity, investment, and employment. In other words, structural reforms may help growth when the economy is constrained from the supply side. But the economy is now suffering from problem of aggregate demand. So, in principle, they are unlikely to be helpful in present circumstances. The underlying idea behind structural reforms is the excessive state intervention is the binding constraint on private sector's efforts to augment supply. Okay, but in the current situation, problem is again different. Hence, the reforms may not be helpful in getting the economy out of its poor output growth. Now, my budget wish list. I wrote a piece which I have circulated. Okay, is the following: boost the government support for migrant workers with employment, income, and food to cope with the humanitarian crisis. Double public health expenditure to 2.5% of GDP in the next 3 years to face the health crisis. India has the dubious distinction of one of the lowest public expenditure on health as a proportion of GDP. Such a strategic plan would call for investment in urban drainage, sanitation, and drinking water. Since building such physical facilities are labor intensive using local resources, they would boost employment of unskilled workers. George Race's idea of decentralized urban employment and training could be a scheme for building public health infrastructure using an urban employment guarantee program. So I endorse this idea as a way to overcome the crisis and also create health infrastructure in urban areas. Recently, Oxfam, a UK charity, said towards the bottom of the overall health spending ranking is India, which has also made cuts in its health budget, albeit small, and has fallen to the third last position in this ranking. This is particularly damaging when just half of India's population has access to even the most essential services, and more than 70% of health spending is being met from household budgets. This has left the country woefully ill-prepared to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Boost public investment in infrastructure to reverse the nearly decade-long economic slowdown. Suspend fiscal deficit rules for now, subject to inflation threat. These are all my budget wish lists. Okay. Budget announcements. Prima facie, FM granted 2 out of my 3 wishes. I could not ask for more. The directional change with respect to public investment and fiscal orthodoxy to boost growth is welcome. The finance minister said the government will borrow an additional 80,000 crore rupees for the purpose in the next 2 months. The estimated fiscal deficit for the fiscal year 2021-22 is 6.8% of GDP for the central government. This is far higher than the official FRBM target of 3%. And states are allowed a higher fiscal deficit if the expenditure is for capital investment. Next item, 137% rise in health expenditure over the previous year. Very little support for jobs and livelihoods. Okay, so as I said, 2 out of my 3 wishes were fulfilled by the budget on the face of it. But there's a need for caution in reading the budget. Okay, budget, after all, is a political statement indicative of political intent. Budget is an occasion for grandstanding. A few months on, few would remember the budget promises. Budget is a financial statement where the fine print matters the most. Hence, a need for caution in reading the budget, need to look beyond the headlines. And okay, reality check. On a closer look, many of the claims made in the budget look deceptive, as often is the case. 34% rise in public investment is not backed by allocation of resources, but largely contingent on realizing the following. Tax revenue realizations, budget seems to present highly optimistic estimates, as many knowledgeable people have said. Disinvestment proceeds, past record is very poor with respect to disinvestment. Sale of rail and road assets, a completely new ball game. We never had this before. These assets are mostly under implementation under PPP mode, that is public-private partnership mode, whose property rights and contingent liabilities are very hazy. Okay, selling public assets will be a Herculean task, if at all possible. The government's ability to raise resources from the market without raising interest rates for the private sector is something to be cautious about. I follow the financial markets, and I find that the long-term interest rates for bonds are already hardening, which means are not coming down or are likely to rise. So which shows that the market may not be willing to accept more bonds from the government. Okay, so there's a caution there. Okay. Similarly, rise in health outlay appears a simple amalgamation of the budget of the Department of Water and Sanitation with health, and one-time grant of 10,000 crore rupees by Finance Commission for states, and 35,000 crore rupee grant for vaccination. Excluding these shuffling of expenditure heads, there is apparently a little substantial hike in health expenditure to strengthen public health services. So net of these 2 basic items, that is Finance Commission grant and grant for vaccination, which is a one-time expenditure, the increase in budget for health is minimal. Okay. On the other hand, shockingly, there's a decline in the allocation for nutrition by 27% compared to last year. This is in spite of the fact that child nutrition outcomes have deteriorated between 2015-16 and 19-20 in select states, for which data has come from NFH's service. On privatization, budget promises massive privatization, seemingly on ideological consideration, in line with the ruling party's election slogan, minimum government, maximum governance. The budget ignores the past record, where a lot of privatization was a mere shuffling of enterprises within the government to raise revenue from cash-rich public sector undertakings, disregarding managerial and efficiency considerations. Past NDA government's record in strategic sale, a euphemism for privatization, were mired in corruption. To refresh the public's short memory, please read Sucheta Dalal's recent reminder. Okay, that would do a lot of good for the current crop of policymakers. In fact, I have given link here just to say Sucheta Dalal is one of the highly regarded financial journalists, and it is to her credit that she was the one who broke the Sanjay Mehta, scam, in 1992. Okay, therefore, she's one of the most respected independent financial journalists, and she has written in this article, which was published 2-3 days ago in her online journal, Money Life, where she reminds us of the various corruption cases involved in the privatization which happened during the previous NDA government. Similarly, budget's proposal to monetize, that is, sell the revenue streams from commercial public services, railway lines, and toll roads are a tall order, considering they are mostly public-private partnerships, often under incomplete and unclear contracts. Okay. Thus, privatization is economically questionable proposition, both in theory and experience, and full of practical hurdles. Disinvestment undertaken in the last few years was guided by the immediate budgetary needs of revenue rather than seeking to impart stock market-based discipline on the functioning of public sector undertakings. Hence, the proposed boosting of public investment contingent upon obtaining resources by privatization is hardly assuring. Rediscovering Development Financial Institution, DFI. DFI, one of the welcome initiatives proposed in the budget, I have been arguing for it for quite a while. Since the abolition of older generation of DFIs, that is ICICI, IDBI, and IFCI, the tenor of lending has shortened and the cost of capital has gone up for infrastructure industries and large industrial projects. The proposed DFI seeks to fulfill the felt needs. However, the budget does not offer a clear roadmap for its creation. Some of the potential problems in the creation of a new DFI are as follows. Government proposes to invite foreign portfolio investors, PFIs, to finance the proposed DFI. This defies the simple principle that PFI investments are for short term, they represent hot money, in search of higher yields. They come into the country to get quick returns, whereas DFI requires long-term, low-cost capital, mostly from domestic sources, to avoid maturity and currency mismatches. So unless there is greater clarity on the institutional design and secure sources of finances, the proposed DFI may be yet another pious intention without the genuine will and vision to promote long-term investment institution. Without stepping up domestic investment, mostly from domestic resources, there is no hope of India clawing back to 8 to 9% GDP growth rate achieved during what I called India's dream run of the decade of the 2000s. Budgetary disappointments. Sadly, the budget has little by way of supporting 10 million migrant workers who lost jobs and livelihoods after the lockdown. Even the economic survey barely mentions the plight of these workers. The recovery after the pandemic appears to be K-shaped, with profits rising and wage rates and wage shares declining. With the stock market booming, India's property class has become richer during the pandemic. To illustrate, the rank of the richest Indian is at the 12th spot on the Bloomberg Billionaire Index in January 2021, up from 40th rank a year ago. While India's hapless migrant workers lost their toehold in the economy. Why could not the budget consider a special tax on the super rich, as many countries are now mooting? Budget does not seem to reckon with such a rise in inequality, let alone seek to redress it. Perhaps it's my naivety, or I'm naive. It's naive on my part to expect it from the ruling dispensation that is doing everything to boost the animal spirits of the entrepreneurial class as a salvation for India's current economic mess. Okay, I conclude. By this time around last year, Economic slowdown was very evident from all available public information, though the government was not willing to admit it publicly. Government was unwilling to admit it, though conservative economic policy and concern with inflation was dominant. COVID-19 pandemic and the economic lockdown were exogenous shocks, contracting the output close to 8% of GDP over the previous year, as per the official estimates. Government takes credit for minimal deaths due to the pandemic, and quick output recovery. Both these claims are questionable. Our neighboring countries seem to have similar health outcomes due to similar social and health conditions. The why I'm mentioning this is that very often it is claimed that India has done very well because India did a very sharp lockdown, and but our neighboring countries who have similar socio-economic conditions also seem to have done roughly similar way. In fact, the output contraction in neighboring countries is much lower than what India faced. So I think there is a lot of chest thumping going on, which needs to be tempered down. I think one needs to look at how comparable countries have performed. Okay. India's economic contraction is one of the worst among world's major economies, barring perhaps Mexico and Argentina. Conservative economic policy meant modest fiscal stimulus to augment aggregate demand. And this is an important point which I often repeat. I think the present government is fiscally very conservative. They strongly believe that the crisis like this is the personal responsibility of individuals, not the state's responsibility to take care. Okay. So they basically believe in, it's individual's responsibility to take care of himself and his or her family. So they do not believe the state has to support the citizens in such cases. Most of the relief package was credit and liquidity support measures and structural reforms. These efforts, in principle, work from the supply side, whereas the real constraints on growth is from the demand side. Budget has sought to boost public infrastructure investment in health, and large-scale privatization as conscious efforts to veer the economy towards the ruling dispensation's ideology, minimum government and maximum governance. There is a proposal to set up a DFI, Development Financial Institution, to supply long-term credit for infrastructure investment. However, there is very little for distressed migrant workers who lost their jobs and livelihoods. Shockingly, the government seems highly insensitive to the plight of the poorest, blaming the pandemic as an act of God. A nation which supported, this is something which comes to my mind often. A nation which supported 10 million refugees from Bangladesh in 1971 for about a year, failed its own migrant workers who were trudging back to their villages after the lockdown. I mean, people of my age would recall that during 1971, there was a 2 rupee. Hello, I'll speak to you. It's a webinar. Sorry. Those of my age would recall that during 1971, Government of India introduced a 2 paisa stamp, the proceeds of which went to support the refugees from Bangladesh. The amount collected probably was not very much, but the fact was, it was a very interesting gesture, or as a signal that India cared for its neighbors' refugees. I mean, and that had an immense effect globally on supporting India. So I'm surprised the same nation when its own poorest were affected by internal crisis, so the lockdown, and the workers were trudging back to their villages. The government and the society failed to provide them minimal support. Though impressive, public investment proposals are underfunded by the budget, with mostly dependent on privatization proceeds. Similarly, seemingly impressive hike in health outlays seems like a fudge of combining various related programs with modest hike in budgetary allocation for health per se. Budget seems high on rhetoric of investment-led economic revival, jettisoning fiscal conservatism for now, and commitment to shrink public sector. For the reasons discussed in the lecture, response seems to fail to come up with the challenges meeting the gravest health and economic crisis the post-independent India has faced. Thank you very much. I'm done with my talk. I'll be happy to.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable and indeed, input on COVID-19 induced crisis and India's response to it. Though, as you mentioned, it was conservative, but yeah, India's response to it through the budget, reflected by the budget. Now, the room is open for questions. I would invite everyone to, write your questions in the chat box if you have any. We'll be happy to address them.
Shreya, can we request Professor Nagaraj to stop sharing this thing so that we can see everyone?
How do I just a minute, I'll do that. Is it clear?
Yes, sir. It's fine now.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. We're waiting for the questions now.
Okay.
Yes, we have got one question from Chandan Kumar. How to minimize the migration from one region to another, not only through the state level, but also the country level? How can we minimize the migration from one region to another? I think this question addresses COVID-19 and the migration you were talking about, the migration that happened.
But
the people going back to their own hometowns, I guess.
But we know that economic migration is an important part of economic development.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we know that entire economic growth. See, imagine a pre-modern, pre-capitalist economy where you had village self-sufficiencies. Okay. From there, modern economy emerged, which is interconnected. Okay. Then your large-scale production emerged, cities emerged, and workers moved from rural agrarian settings to urban settings because urban settings offer better wages, and urban employers employ them because they get their productivity is higher, and large-scale movement of labor from traditional agriculture to modern industrial settings is the essence of structural transformation from a low productive agriculture to more productive industry and later services. So the idea is not to ask for no migration.
Yes.
That will be seeking to put the clock back. Okay, that will be stagnation. In fact, rural areas, there are no jobs.
Exactly.
In fact, that's why I say I would request you kindly read the various records which have come from this. People went back to village for immediate safety, but there are no jobs. There's nothing they could do. Therefore, In fact, lots of them have come back to cities because that's the only way they can survive. Okay, so I think seeking to undo, put the clock back of migration is basically retrograde economic step. Okay, so migration has to increase. In fact, India is today the most agrarian or rural economy in the world. Okay, India today, if you know, up to 69% of workers or population lives in villages. Okay, China, the figure is about 50%. Okay, so in fact, the China's miraculous growth was precisely because they were able to transform millions of workers from rural setting to more productive urban settings. In fact, we should be able to do something similar if we really want to grow fast. Okay, so but the question is, how do we provide them with some minimal social security, minimum urban facilities, so that they can continue to live in urban areas and productively contribute to the economy. And the laws should take care of their some minimum security and safety and health, which is possible. In fact, our labor laws provide for it, but they are not usually implemented. Yeah, does it answer the question?
Yes, sir, definitely. It has answered the question. I think the person must have not asked about the migration thing. He must have been asking about the people moving from, their workplace to their hometowns due to COVID. I think that's the issue that he was talking about. So we have got one more question. The budgeted expenditure on MNREGA and other social security schemes for 2021 was much lower than the actual expenditure due to COVID-19. Despite that, the budgeted expenditure for 2021 and 22 hasn't increased much. Do you think it is the right way to go about to address the unemployment situation and the agrarian distress in rural India?
I think the person has asked the right question. In fact, I did not talk about the NRG. In fact, I have talked only about a few issues which concern me in the budget. There are many more issues I did not talk about. NRG is one of them. In fact, lots of commentators have said that the budget for NRGA has not increased. I don't remember the figures right now. I think which is not right. In fact, if I were to go by the recent newspaper reports, the people demanding NRGA work in rural areas is continuing to rise. I think which is a clear indication of the jobs situation in the rural economy, okay, or the lack of jobs, unemployment situation in the rural economy. So, gauging at that, the government should have increased the budgetary support, but government doesn't seem particularly enthused about this program. Even during the peak of the pandemic, when millions of workers were going back to villages, the increase in NRG expenditure was very modest, if at all. In fact, as I mentioned in my presentation, that if you take the total government expenditure, all departments, during the first half of 2020, that is April, September, the total expenditure, government expenditure, was not higher than what it was during the previous year for the same period, which means that despite all the talk about supporting supporting the people affected by the crisis and various schemes and Atmanirbhar Bharat and all the talk, the actual expenditure by the government did not increase. This is what I call the conservatism or the fiscal conservatism of the present government, which is quite contrast to all the countries which I mentioned. In fact, if you see my graph, all countries, all major countries, including our neighbors, including a poor country like Vietnam, Bangladesh, have done better than us. And expectedly, the fall in their output was much less than us, because the income goes to consume, and that supports output, right? So India has been extremely conservative in this crisis. And that's what I say, that's the guiding principle of the present dispensation, it looks like.
Okay, so taking this point that the government is fiscally conservative and going for privatization for its every kind of financing, we have this question by Roshan Kumar, who's asking that is the current government going for creating an arena where citizen has just become a client?
I don't know, the citizens, I think it's I don't know what I'm going to say will answer the question. A client is someone who has money in pocket.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? This is my very laymanish understanding of who do you call a client? Who's willing to pay for a service or a product?
Yeah. Who's willing
Right?
to pay for the product?
But when 40% of the people have nothing, would they call them client? So the government doesn't care for them. Despite all the rhetoric of so many schemes, so many things, and we have overflowing food stocks, but the government has been extremely conservative in releasing these stocks for the poor and the workers who are walking along the roads. So therefore, it doesn't seem to care for them. I mean, I'm going by the outcomes. I'm not going by their pious words. Okay. So where are they putting their money? They're putting their money in where they see return, and that return is that they are giving money to the entrepreneurial class or the capitalist class. In fact, if you recall the previous budget, 2019-20, in fact, reduced the taxation for companies. Under the argument, look, Indian tax rates are much higher than comparable advanced countries. Therefore, India should reduce taxes. Okay, so India, the present dispensation is very openly, outwardly a pro-capitalist, a pro-entrepreneur government. Okay. I'm not going by their statements. I'm going by their deeds. Okay, and this is very clear. In fact, if you see what the Prime Minister said at the Niti Aayog meeting yesterday, he did not talk about as per the news reports. He did not talk about stepping up investments for growth. He only talked about making easing conditions for business to do business. In fact, as you know, the Niti Aayog spent considerable of its human capital or its political capital in improving the ease of doing business index, about which I have written. Okay, and India now, the government very proudly claims that its ranking in the world has moved up from 140 to some 56 or something. Okay, between 2015 and 2020. Okay, but has it led to increase in entrepreneurial activity? Entrepreneurial activity has to get translated into investments and output, which has not happened. I mean, as the growth rate has fallen year after year. Okay, so what does this idea of increasing improving the ease of doing business, which is the bogus index? And in fact, at the ground level, very often this has meant diluting labor laws. In fact, today, I would encourage some young students to go and check with the labor departments of Delhi or the neighboring states. Okay, go to the labor department, see how exactly these labor laws are implemented. Today, many of these labor laws are implemented by self-certification by entrepreneurs, which means that entrepreneur claims that he or she is following a certain labor law, and that's it. That government takes his or her word as true. There is very little checks, and there is no official verification of this. And my suspicion is that is probably the reason why we have been having increasing large accidents. This is my conjecture. I am to do research on it. Okay, so These are all the negative fallout on the workers. Not only that, this affects the employers as well because their insurance cost goes up. But that's the government is not bothered to think long term. Okay, so just by easing conditions of business will not grow business. The demand conditions are very different today. That is something which the government doesn't seem to fully appreciate. Does it answer?
Yes, sir, I think so.
Okay.
Yes. So we are getting few questions now. What are your views on providing income security to those who are employed in the informal sector? And how do we provide them, especially those who experience impoverishment?
Yeah, this is a large question. I have no ready answers. You see, it's possible. In fact, income support. In fact, the various arguments for what we call the basic income scheme, basic income support, where which is being tried out in various pockets in the world, various countries or various cities. Regardless of one's economic status, every citizen is entitled to minimum income. Or in Indian conditions, there have been argument that there has to be minimum social security. Every individual should have a minimum social security if he or she loses a job. Okay, but I do not know how it. In fact, there's an argument that basically NREGA schemes are basically the income support scheme, but it is not unconditional. It is that these self-selected workers agree to work and agree to productive work and contribute to output, and hence the state supports them with certain income, certain wages. Okay, so that is possible. So I think how exactly, in fact, there are theoretical, there are ideas. In fact, Professor Amit Bhadri's scheme of employment for sorry, I forget the name of the book. Okay, development with dignity. That is the title of his book, where he talks about every individual has a right to work, and therefore and it's possible to provide it even for a poor country. I have personally not looked at it, but I think it may be possible. But problem is that if it is not productive work, then it could be inflationary. It is not simply distributing money. The money has to be, the work has to be productive. Okay, and if it is so, maybe it's possible, but offhand, I cannot say that it's something which is which can be implemented immediately. It is possible to work towards it.
Okay, so productive
work. I think that's very important. It is not just giving everybody a certain amount of cash every month. Okay, that could lead to, unless there is excess capacity in the economy, enough food grains in the economy, it could lead to inflationary pressures.
Okay, yes, sir. So, sir, you were talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. There's one question related to that. As I know, only a good importer can be a good exporter. So, is emphasis on Atmanirbhar Bharat and on import substitution can it be beneficial for the economy?
Okay. See, imports and exports both are required. It's not that when you say import substitution is a negation of complete exports. No, we are not talking about a autarkic economy. Okay, but what's important? When the Prime Minister mentioned this in May last year, I could sense. I could see the gravity which he was hinting at, gravity of the situation of the country. India was dependent on China for imports of bulk drugs, which are required to tackle the pandemic. Okay, I suppose that's what made him realize how import dependent India has become. Similarly, another area which again is important for national self-sufficiency, national security is fertilizer. India has become dependent on imports of fertilizers. We know that agriculture is a question of self-sufficiency and national food security. So there are some of the issues in which India has become dependent. So therefore, there is a need for correcting for it. Okay, I think India has India's import dependency overall, particularly on the electronic hardware, has become very, very high, which is a cause for concern, and it is also a security risk. And in fact, which was discovered, as you know, when India decided to clamp down on Chinese imports, immediately it affected a host of domestic manufacturing industries. Okay, so that does not mean that we need not promote domestic manufacturing. It has to be done carefully so that you increase your domestic production by increasing investments, having a strategic plan to augment domestic capabilities, domestic hardware manufacturing, domestic R&D to create newer products or import substitutes without affecting your current production, current needs. I mean, that's what that requires a strategic thinking, which unfortunately seems to be missing in current days. Okay, in fact, it has to be done carefully. It has to be. It's not a 0-1 situation, but it's like a spectrum of policies one needs to follow. Okay, so if that is done, I think India can and should become more self-reliant on many issues, many things, and become exporters in due course of time. Okay, after all, it's a learning process. Okay, I mean, you start as an importer, but over time you acquire competence and then enter into the export markets. Okay, but that requires a strategic thinking and strategic action, which probably is missing. And I'm very worried that when government talks about import of, I mean, allowing FDI even in defense production, no country in the world thinks of inviting FDI in defense production. And current government is, talks in a forked tongue. When at one hand it says Atmanirbhar Bharat, and in the next breath it says that we want to invite FDI in defense manufacturing. Both are, to any reasonable person, and even for a commonsensically, they are incompatible. Okay, but the government happily keeps talking about it. The Prime Minister keeps talking about it. Okay, and this is which I mean, I fail to understand that. So therefore, I am for Atmanirbhar Bharat, but does not mean you become closed economy. No, you require a strategic interventions in industrial sector, especially high technology industry, so that you increase your domestic capabilities and gradually reduce import dependence, and eventually you can also become exporter. I mean, this is how most countries have acquired industrial competencies and export capabilities. Okay, that's what we should aim at. But I think what government is doing, I fully don't understand.
Okay.
Does it answer?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So we have few questions more. Would you be happy to address them?
No problem. Please continue. No problem.
Okay, sir. Finance Minister talks about 1 or 2 crore deposit in PF. So who can be such persons? Why a teacher like us suffers from their contribution in PF, new tax on interest on PF deposit?
Good question, but I retired last June, so I got my pay, my cash. The IGIDR was kind enough; they deposited my dues in my account. Okay, so my PF account is closed. So honestly, I'm not looked at how it's going to affect everyone. But this is on the lighter side. Okay, on the more seriously, there seems to be some loophole somewhere, which some corporate, some rich people, or to use euphemism, high net worth individuals, NHIs, high net worth individuals have been misusing the system, and that's what I understand from the news reports. There is some clause somewhere. See, in my simple understanding, I thought that the employer deducts your PF, and you cannot contribute more than what is in the 1.5 lakh per year or whatever that amount. But there seems to be some clause where some people are able to put in more money and get assured return of 8% plus, and therefore that's what is the cause of it. So in fact, some news reports say that it's about a few thousand rich individuals who have gamed the system, and which is likely to affect the millions of other ordinary individuals. Okay, I'm not claiming any responsibility for this statement. I'm just reporting what I've read. If that is the case, the government should plug that loophole and should not penalize the ordinary savings, ordinary citizens who have been putting in money for also their careers. So if there is a loophole, see, loopholes do come up in many laws, you know it. But that's the idea of a sensitive government, or a responsive government, we should be able to plug the loopholes, suitably. I hope they do it. I think the finance minister has made some point this morning about it. I hope that will be done.
So one of your demand from government have been in the direction of R&D, research and development.
Yes.
So how you analyze the fund proposal of 50,000 in R&D in the budget?
So sorry, I mean, it's a good question. I have not. You see, a lot of. See, I am not. Honestly, I have not really looked at the budget very closely. Every item, on the face of it, it looks very good. But unless you understand the fine print, as I mentioned, I have not. I hope I'll be able to look at it sometime, but honestly, I have not looked at it. But it's a great if this proposal in the budget is able to reverse the trend of declining R&D expenditure to GDP ratio, I'll be very happy person. Okay, because India's expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP has declined over the last 3 decades. Which is a sad commentary. In fact, I put my head in shame when you see ball pens these days sold saying that technology imported from Germany. Okay, and they proudly say Cello or whatever the name of the company, and they say technology imported from Japan. It's a shame that Indian companies pride themselves of importing technology for ball pens, and Indian customers lap it up. Isn't it a shame? Okay, doesn't matter. Suppose you are importing it. China also does. That's not a. But China exports on the net basis and earns foreign exchange out of it. If you're able to do it, you have earned your foreign exchange to import the technology. But that's not the case with India. Okay, so it's a shame that we have become so import dependent. Okay, I mean that's a. So please, I'm not saying that we should be autarkic country. No, I think India should be reasonably open. Okay, trading nation. Okay, but it does not mean that if you are securely become import dependent, okay, and your national security or food security is contingent upon imports, then it's surely a matter of concern for any country.
If DFI will be financed by FPI, is it good for having a sustainable or long-term infrastructural capital expenditure?
No, which is what I mentioned. Maybe what I mentioned in my lecture was not clear. It's a little, maybe a little technical. I mentioned. You see, DFI requires a long-term capital at low interest rate, which they can use to lend for long term, again at relatively low interest rate. Okay, where do you get low long term resources? See, what is the requirement? What is the requirement of infrastructure sector? Infrastructure is basically, infrastructure by definition is a low return long term investments. Is it long term investments? Gestation periods are long. Returns for a long period of time. Once you build a metro line, it runs for 100 years. Okay, but the rate of return on it is going to be very low. Okay, but that is the typical characteristic of any infrastructure. Yeah. So such investments require long-term capital with low interest rates. Okay, FPI, basically, they invest for short term, that is less than 1 year. And they come in, they go around the world looking for getting better return over a short period. Okay, and it is what in financial terms they call hot money. If tomorrow our neighbors offer a better rate of return, they will fly to the other country to get better return, because they have to satisfy their investors who want to maximize their returns, right? So FPI investing in DFI is simply contradiction in terms. It simply doesn't make sense. They will not invest in it. Okay.
So it's not sustainable.
So it's not sustainable.
Yes.
Okay. Therefore, what you should look for is long-term capital. Where do you get long-term capital? Okay. Internationally, the globe is flooded with capital, but they're not long-term capital. They're short-term capital, or at best 3-year duration capital. Whereas we require long-term capital. Who gives you long-term capital? There are international institutions who might offer, or you must require domestic savings. World over, DFIs are promoted or supported by domestic savings. See, our savings are also for long term. Suppose we all save in PF for long term.
Yes.
Or say pension funds, provident funds. Okay, post office deposits. Because you may get lower interest, but you want the safety of government guarantee, right? World over, most DFIs are supported by domestic capital, domestic long-term savings. Just to give an example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Singapore. Singapore has, the provident fund EPF in India. We pay about how much? About 10%. In India, every organized sector worker pays 10%, and 10% is supported by the employer, and that's put in the EPF. Okay, and that the employee gets at the end of his service. In Singapore, employees have to pay 30% of their income as EPF. 30%, 1/3 of your salary. Okay. In turn, the state offers you long-term investments like housing, for which you keep paying all through your career. But this way, the state is able to mobilize a huge amount of savings and create capital for the society. Variants of it are available throughout East Asia. Even today, Japan Post is the biggest savings institution in the world. Japanese citizens are most happy to put their money in Japanese post office, which offers them an interest rate which is marginally higher than the ruling short-term interest rates, but it is absolutely safe because it's backed by the Japanese government. And Japanese government mobilizes the savings, puts in DFIs, which are controlled by finance ministry, and those are invested in long-term investments like building infrastructure, all that. Okay, and that is outside the budget. Regardless of the budgetary fluctuations, investments on those are not cut. If you in terms of macroeconomics, if you recall, you have the autonomous A in your Keynesian equation. It is literally equivalent to that autonomous A, which are controlled by the state, and investments are made for the long term. Okay, and that is how these East Asian economies have mobilized huge savings and invested productively for the long term. India, we also have similar institutions, but we have systematically undermined them in the name of financial liberalization, which is wrong. Okay, so in fact, we destroyed our own long-term institutions like ICICI, IDBI, and IFCI, and now we are trying to reimagine them.
Yeah.
Okay, and therefore the point is, unless they are backed by domestic capital, okay, they will not be able to survive. Domestic long-term capital, they will not be able to survive.
Okay.
Does it
Thank
answer?
you for the detailed explanation. We'll take up the last question now. It's related to the public health expenditure. Is providing insurance coverage like Ayushman Bharat without increasing public health expenditure, can it deal with two bullets? One is increasing the global burden of diseases, and then on the other hand, increasing the catastrophic health expenditure.
Okay. If I understood this Ayushman Bharat, they are basically subsidizing hospitals, not the individuals. We have similar variants of it. Earlier on, I think particularly the South Indian states were in the forefront of implementing. I think Andhra government was doing it in a large scale. Okay, in which in effect was subsidizing private hospitals rather than the out-of-pocket expenditure of the individuals. Okay, therefore, I think the whole insurance-based model, I think this is something which we have unfortunately borrowed from America, is wrong. Before insurance comes, basic public health. India doesn't have basic sanitation, drinking water, drainage, sewerage. Okay, which is what we must invest on, public health or public. We require public health in terms of public clinics, hospitals, which take care of most of our disease. Okay, only then one can think of insurance. And insurance, again, the American model, which has been promoted by all the governments since during the last 2 decades, is a completely wrong model for India. I mean, I'll give an example. See, the US system is completely botched health system. Just to I'll give an idea. The US spends 19% of its GDP on health. 19%. If you don't trust my numbers, check it out on the internet. Okay, but their health outcomes are worse than that in average of rich countries or OECD countries. In fact, their neighbor Canada spends only 8% of its GDP on health, but its health outcomes, the standard outcomes, longevity, all various indicators, Canada is far superior to the US. Okay, unfortunately, we in India, under the pressure from the financial interests and the lobby of doctors, private doctors, we seem to have been moving towards an American model, which is the world's worst model. Okay, and the insurance comes there. Okay, the insurance-based model of this kind, okay, which is wrong. Okay, I think we need to rethink about it. Before comes insurance, I would say put money on public health. That would be my suggestion.
Basic sanitation and hygiene.
Basic hygiene and public hospitals of simple kinds. I would say in the earlier days we had something called primary health centers, okay, or district hospital where you have large OPDs, outpatient departments, where for every small thing you don't have to get admitted to the hospital. Okay, a lot of our diseases are related to infection. Even today, most our morbidity is because of infections, because that comes out of lack of clear drinking water and water sanitation and clean air. Okay, if you take care of that, the requirement of many of this will go down, and I think only then, when you have met the public health, then you can think of specialized health.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we learned a lot today from you. The way you answered each and every question so patiently, it was just great. Thank you so much, sir, for that. Now I would like to invite Juhi to extend the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Economic Society Deshbandhu College, I take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to Professor R. Nagaraj for enlightening us with his knowledgeable and thought-provoking talk. Today's lecture gave us deep insights into the budget, COVID-induced economic crisis, job loss growth, and changes in labor codes. I'm pretty sure that our students have gained a lot from this informative session. We look forward to have more such sessions with you in future. Once again, I would like to thank you for taking out time and enhancing our understanding pertaining to the new budget and its impact on the economy. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would also like to thank our principal sir, Dr. Rajiv Agarwal, for his enthusiastic support and motivation. A special thanks to Sangeeta ma'am for encouraging us and making all the efforts. I would also like to thank Dr. Aditya Saxena, Coordinator IQAC, for the smooth functioning of the lecture. A big thank you to all the faculty members of Economics Department and all other departments for their active participation. Our heartfelt thanks to Economics Student Union for their support and coordination. Lastly, thank you all of you for your active participation.